welcome. So we'll begin.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidikena yopakurutam pravaram muninam padanchalim pranchaliranatosmi stuve padanchalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam kartrasutrasya bhashyasya kramad vivaranasya cha. Those of you who joined later and are not familiar with the meaning of this invocation, these two verses that I chant at the beginning of the class, you can ask for an explanation during the interaction. Most welcome. So I think in the last session we were discussing the 9th sutra that you'll remember. That is the 5th in the chronology of kleshas. I mean, avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, klesha. So, these are the 5 kleshas. So, we should keep in mind what are the real implications of these technical terms used in Sanskrit, especially in yoga. So, there are 2 types of understanding the meaning. First, how it is translated in the standard works. Then, what it actually implies in the context of our own life. Because yoga is not just a theoretical science. Every idea that is expressed and discussed in the yoga and the yoga philosophy has an intimate corresponding implication in the context of our psychological life and eventually in our spiritual life. This is a very important point, remember. A term may have a well-structured definition in the standard commentaries in Sanskrit, and also the attempts to translate those Sanskrit terms into English. But what they really mean should be properly understood. Then only we can enter the world of yoga psychology. So what is klesha? Klesha may be translated in some of the books as afflictions, sufferings, and so on. What it actually implies is this. I have to explain in a few sentences. Whatever we do, any kind of physical activity, any verbal activity, word we speak, a thought we think, all this will come to an end when that activity is over, apparently. But really speaking, that activity doesn't end there. It leaves in our mental system a residual effect, which is technically called vritti. Well, this is a Sanskrit word used in yoga psychology, yoga text, yoga context. What it means, how we recollect an event or an action or an activity that we have experienced, either from external world or our own activity, how we recollect, how we remember, how the memory of that activity continues to influence our actions, our thoughts and deeds and words later. So there is a connecting bridge between that memory that is left behind, the residual effect that is left behind, and also its consequence. Not necessarily in this life, according to yoga, even the succeeding life cycles. It could be in the form of suffering. It could be in the form of afflictions. That is the most common experience. Because when a person goes through some kind of intense experience, the intensity, if it is of a tragic type, then its lingering effect will be much longer. That this study in modern psychoanalysis and of course in modern psychiatry has led to different theories, but the surprising revelation is that in the yoga in the commentary literature, there is a very elaborate and very scientific, rational explanation of how these tendencies which are left behind will continue to influence our action. So that is called klesha. And then in the coming sutras, we will discuss another interesting aspect of yoga, Karmasia, which is a repository of all these memories which are deposited there, which continue to influence our actions or life in this life or the next. Now, one may ask this question: what's the use of knowing all this? We can just concentrate on the present day life, that's a modern motto. Today, now, what do we want? It has got a very distorted and tragic impact on us. If you concentrate too much on today and now, then there will be no end to problems. If you can look behind and through some apparent experience, then only we get an explanation. Anyway, that's what I want to prepare our mind, our audience for this discussion that is unfolding in the coming sutras. So, Abhinivesha was the last klesha we discussed. Abhinivesha it expresses in the form of our natural lingering, clinging to life, which actually, in other words, expresses in the idea that we don't want to die, that death is impossible for me, and so on. So, of course, remember, Yoga Sutra is not discussing death. What Yoga Sutra is discussing is this unique human psychological phenomenon of a forgetting a reality which is one of the most undeniable realities in human life, the reality of life and the reality of death. So all fears, all anxieties, all worries are indirectly at least linked to this lingering to life. We discussed this earlier, and of course the yoga psychologists, yoga commentators tried to explain this in the light of one important tool of epistemology, that is inference. It's called anumana. You don't remember, you can't do anything that you're totally unfamiliar with. You can't remember anything that you have not experienced previously. That's how they explain. Suppose animals, birds, different creatures, and also human beings, they are born with certain tendencies which they are not taught. These tendencies are not a result of any effort to study, but they are born, which we call instinct. That's what we call instinct. Instinct is, according to yoga, nothing but a recapitulation of previous experience. The instinct doesn't fall from the sky. It doesn't originate in a vacuum. Instinct is nothing but practiced art that we have experienced in previous life. And mind has got these three levels. Instinct, where reason may not be very much involved. Then second stage is reason. And the third stage is the higher superconscious state, which is what Yoga Sutra eventually will teach us, will explain to us how to achieve. That's the point. That is superconscious state, where we act in a way which is unerring, but without the use of reason. We go beyond reason to act in a reasonable, in a proper manner. That's what we'll discuss later. So this is Abhinivesa. Now the next sutra is Te Pradiprasavaheyaha Sukshmaha. So these are the word Te. Te he means they. So what are these? They means these kleshas that we discussed earlier, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, etc. Extreme liking for certain things, extreme dislike for certain things, and extreme fear of certain things, extreme infatuation of certain things, and all these originating from our own wrong perception of our own true identity, that is asmita. So all these kleshas can be eradicated, can be undone through counter evolution. That is the meaning of pradiprasava. Prasava means taking birth. Pradiprasava means the opposite of it. The effect going back to cause. That's something very interesting. So Yoga Sutra will tell you that spiritual practices like the Kriya Yoga that we discussed, that is Tapa, Swadhyaya, Ishwar Pranidhana, that is austerity, self-study, including meditation and contemplation, and resignation to God. All these help us to weaken, to make only subtle, but just that is weakening these kleshas. They do not destroy the kleshas. So let's see what it means by weakening. Suppose a person is afflicted with this problem of extreme dislike for certain things, extreme infatuation for certain things. Of course, this has got very, very practical relevance in our life. Drug addiction, alcoholism, obsession with internet, computer games. All these are classical examples, are expressions, gross expressions of these kleshas. Now these, let's say a person sits somewhere and thinks, you call it meditation, let us say, and thinks of the consequences of what he is doing, at least when he is free from the effect of drugs or alcohol, whatever. He is sitting somewhere, maybe reading some book, so adhyaya comes, and sits for some time. Then his mind may wander, well, was it okay? Is it? First he develops an awareness of the fact that he needs to get over this problem. And then what happens, if he continues this contemplation, meditation, whatever it is, then his strong desire to get rid of this problem will strengthen, will be reinforced. And proportionately, if he practices this klesha, this samskara, this impression, this tendency, which he wants to get rid of, which he himself wants to get out of, is aware of the tremendous problem it is, but still he is not able to do that. That is the effect of klesha. Samskaras or tendency which have gone deep into our mental system. And we are aware of their existence. And we are aware of the need to get out of this. We have sincere desire to get out of this, but not able to do that. That's an example of klesha samskara. Remember, klesha samskaras are very deep rooted. They can travel from one life cycle to another life cycle. So that's why they are all deposited in the particular repository of samskara. It's called Karmasia. That's what we are going to discuss in the coming sutras, which is a very important theme in the Yoga Sutra. which the commentators have taken pains to explain from different angles. That will help us to know why we act in a certain manner, though we want to act differently. So, how we get hooked into a tendency or a practice or a way of thinking, this lingering negativity, mind creating a stumbling block, and also you find sometimes it has got very, very strange manifestations. You find certain people very cordial outwardly, but a strong sense of egoism within, talking very nicely, talking like a Socrates, maybe smiling in a very patrician manner. I have seen such people, but very strong negative ego, but outwardly very cordial. They go on suffering from problems. On the other side, you can find people who are outwardly very, very arrogant looking, look very arrogant, but actually very polite and humble. So you can find these two contradictions, contrary human characters. So there are examples of these deep-rooted samskaras which we get hooked into. Now, Yoga Sutra actually it makes a very revolutionary contribution. Maybe I think the entire range of human learning, philosophical systems, spiritual practices, Yoga Sutras alone actually tell us that we can change our own personality without the help of medicine, of course. So Yoga Sutra is just the antithesis of predeterminism. Frequently, people will tell you, there are many interesting sayings in different languages. Man will tell you, if he is destined to be hanged, he cannot be drowned. He cannot be drowned if he is destined to be hanged. Everything is in the hands of fate or determination in the hands of somebody else. But Yoga Sutra takes the opposite stand. It tells you, you can change your destiny. You can mold, you can transform, you can refine your own fate. How we can change the way we think, the way we act, our own real personality, not external diplomatic refinements or nothing of the kind, but we can think the way our own mind functions. We can change, we can refine. That's what it says. Now, that process is called Pratiprasava. Pratiprasava means all these tendencies can be completely eradicated, in the sense they become totally non-functional. Not by meditation. Meditation can only weaken them. But Pratiprasava means through constant spiritual practice, including yoga, which we are going to discuss in the Ashtanga Yoga in the coming chapters. We will discuss Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, Asampragnata Samadhi. You can mention Viveka Khyadi, the dawn of spiritual wisdom, all we discuss. So through these, we can really eradicate our own tendencies, negative tendencies. First, we can weaken them through contemplation and meditation. Now, meditation need not necessarily be taken in its religious, ritualistic sense, not at all. Just think somewhere, let us say, suppose a person can think, sit somewhere and contemplate silently of what he is doing. It is actually meditation. Meditation, as practiced by devotees of God, will take the help of God, which is very helpful. That's why Ishvara Pranidhana is mentioned as part of the Kriya Yoga. That is very important. So, resignation to God is a great help, because you feel a great lift great weight lifted off our shoulders. So, for devotees of God, for those who are practicing certain spiritual disciplines, this becomes easy. Even for others, this is possible. So, the underlying principle is meditation can control samskaras, subdue their power, weaken them, and turn them from gross into subtle. They become subtle. The danger is when an appropriate set of circumstances emerge where these tendencies can remanifest, they will certainly express themselves. That is the problem. But still, contemplation can weaken, can control. You'll be able to handle negative tendencies through contemplation or meditation. And here in the 10th sutra, Patanjali says they can be eradicated. So, all these klesha samskaras which are being weakened and made subtle can be eradicated completely through pratiprasava. So, pratiprasava means counter evolution. We'll find out in course of discussion, we'll find out what this actually is. Pratiprasava means chitta pralaya, means our mind getting dissolved into what it came from, the effect going back to its cause. That again involves this Ashtanga Yoga, this Ahimsa, Satya, Steya, Brahmacharya, Parigraha, this Yamas, and then Niyama, Sauja, Sandosha, Tapaswa, Adhyaya, Ishvabnidhana, and again, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, all this will involve. So this will help us to completely eradicate these negative samskaras. Of course, commentators have made great contribution to this concept. So Bhoja, Bhoja is one of the great commentators. He wrote, Raja Martanda and Bhojavurti. Bhojavurti is a small book. Raja Martanda is much more well known. He says, for example, Te Sukshma Kleshaha Ye Vasana Rupenaiva Sthitaha Navritti Rupam Parinamam Arabhante. So what happens, through Kriya Yoga, these tendencies, they just remain as subtle vrittis, but they do not prompt you into action. Let us say, I mentioned this earlier, a tendency that you want to get out of. When we meditate on that tendency and its evil consequences for a long time, then we become aware of the need to get out of this. This awareness will prompt us to take steps to get out of it. It could be drug addiction, all these problems. So practice of Kriya Yoga weakens these samskaras. That is called Tanukarana. We already discussed this earlier. And now Bhoja says that they become completely eradicated through Pratiprasava. So what happens, the Pratiprasava means counter origination. So what happens is, through meditation, these tendencies that are creating problems for us can be neutralized, can be made non-functional at a higher stage of meditation, not immediately. Still, they remain as tendencies and they become completely eradicated through Pratiprasava. Then it becomes, like a seed that is being burnt. A seed that is burnt is not different from a piece of stone. A piece of stone cannot become a plant. It cannot sprout. So also a seed that is burnt cannot sprout. So the great yogis are those who have completely overcome the deadly effect of negative tendencies. That's why it is said, those who practice yoga can use their five senses and mind simultaneously and concentrate on what they are doing. That is the art of concentration mentioned in the Yoga Sutra. Normally, when we see an object, our mind and eyes are focused on that object. When we come to know something by hearing, let's say we come to know of a car moving the streets by hearing the sound, then we come to know of the car moving. A yogi can simultaneously look at something and concentrate all his five senses completely on that object. That's why yogis can remember things for a long time, because they can get whatever they experience, whatever they cognize with greater intensity of focus. Here, of course, there is an interesting discussion by Vyasa on this subject. So Vyasa says, Kleshaihi aparamrishta sattva purusha anyatha khyadi sukshma prajna samapta adhikrita pradiprasava kalpishide iti. That Vyasa Bhasha says. He says, when this really happens, what happens, when this viveka khyadi, the knowledge arises, when the kleshas are completely eradicated, then only the light of prajna, that is, sukshma prajna, only the light of supreme knowledge alone will remain. And this is called viveka khyadi. And this viveka khyadi, this higher knowledge, is completely untouched by kleshas. Now we'll come to the next sutra. Of course, here I can discuss something from a great commentator, and his name is Vijnana Bhikshu, who wrote this Yoga Bhashya Vartikam. So, according to Vijnana Bhikshu, Kriya Yoga Klesadanukarnartham ityuktam tatra Klesadanukarnasya phalam bhaktumaha. So, Kriya Yoga is mentioned here for weakening kleshas. We already discussed this. Tapa, Swadhyaya, Ishwar Pranidhananani Kriya Yoga, the first sutra. Kriya Yoga involves austerity, practice of austerity, reading of holy books or listening to holy word symbols like Pranava, Onkara, and also resignation to God. Of course, by implication, Kriya Yoga also involves Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. All these are involved at their early stages. Remember, Bhakti Yoga, its highest stage is different. Karma Yoga, its highest stage is Karma Nishtha, Chitta Shuddhi, Moksha Prapti, etc. That is different. But for a practitioner, that is Sadhana Pada stage, when a practitioner does some noble act without any selfish motive, he is able to generate spiritual energy that will help him to enter the path of yoga, that is Kriya Yoga. Similarly, Swadhyaya, reading holy books, listening to mantras, holy word symbols. Here Pranava is given a lot of importance in the traditional commentaries. Then by constant listening and then remembering, that is Sravanam and Smaranam, listening and remembering, will prompt us to contemplate on what we are hearing, and that will generate spiritual energy. So also resignation to God. All this will help us to weaken the kleshas. That's why, Kriya Yoga Kleshadanugarnartham ityuktam, referring to previous sutra. Kriya Yoga is meant to make subtle these kleshas. When these klesha samskaras are gross, then there is an impulsive action on the part of the person. Suppose our samskaras are in their gross dimension, there will be an impulsive tendency to do that. When that tendency becomes subtle, that is called klesh tanugaranartham, means when they become weakened, then we think for some time, is it okay for me to do that? So you are able to practice self-restraint. That's why it is, meditation helps you to weaken. Meditation as a part of Kriya Yoga will help you to weaken or to make subtle these klesha samskaras. If they are left to remain in their gross form, they can prompt us to act according to these acquired samskaras. If they can be made subtle, then we know these samskaras are already there in our mental system. We also know that we should try to get rid of them. So this awareness of the need to get rid of them will make us think and self-restraint. So they will not express impulsively. That's why he says, Kriya Yoga klesha tanugaranartham ityuktam tatra klesha tanugaranasya phalam vaktumaha. So Kriya Yoga is mentioned for the sake of weakening these kleshas. Now, what happened to them? Te pratiprasavaheyaha sukshmaha. So these sukshma samskaras pratiprasavaheyaha. They are to be eradicated by counter-evolution. You may call it involution. We have reached all the way from Prakriti to Panchatanmatras. Panchatanmatra, Panchamahabhutas. Now from Panchamahabhutas, we have to go back to the origin. So that's the idea behind. You have to remember the Sankhyan or Yoga concept of creation. I mentioned this earlier, but should be kept in mind. There are two fundamental categories. That's why Sankhya and Yoga systems are supposed to be dualistic systems. Purusha and Prakriti. From Prakriti, this entire universe emerges, including our body, our mind, our senses, everything, and also the empirical world. So Prakriti becomes Mahatattvam. From that Ahankara, Mahatattva may be called cosmic intelligence. From the Ahankara comes. Ahankara has got Rajasiga, Tamasiga and Sattviga dimensions. And from Sattviga, Rajasiga dimensions, all the five senses of perception, five senses of action, and also the mind emerges. And then from the Tamasiga dimension of Ahankara, Panchatanmatras emerge. From Panchatanmatras, Panchamahabhutas, which constitute the empirical world. So we have reached the right bottom. Now we have to counter-evolve. It's like a huge tree should go back to its seed from which it came. See, something like that. Of course, in the context of a tree, it is impossible. But in the context of our mind, it is possible. It is possible. It is not impossible. The analogy stops there. So, what we do when we practice spiritual disciplines, we are actually trying to counter-evolve. We are trying to evolve from the level of external empirical phenomena, and then from the levels of mind and intellect, and finally we reach the origin of this evolution is called Prakriti. And then we will identify our true identity with Purusha. So this is the process. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, yoga concept of evolution is very scientific, by yoga concept of conclusion, yoga's conclusion of the absolute reality has a lot to be desired according to Shankaracharya. But remember, it's very important. All the great Indian philosophical systems, including the Buddha system, which doesn't, Buddhism doesn't accept Vedas as a pramana, as a supreme authority, so it is called heterodox or non-orthodox system. Even Buddhism also, even Jainism also accepts the yoga analysis of human mind, the senses, the vrittis, samskaras, and many other important disciplines. All the great Vedantins, including the great Shankaracharya himself, was a great practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga. Practically, you cannot think of one really great spiritual teacher in the Vedantic tradition, Vedic tradition, who was not a practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga. Vivekananda was a Vedantin par excellence. He was the one who championed Vedanta in modern times. And he was his translation, his exposition of Yoga Sutras in modern times remains unrivaled as the best introduction of yoga psychology and yoga philosophy to a modern English-speaking world. There was a practitioner of Raja Yoga, Guru Sri Ramakrishna, Velimada, all these great. So that's an important point to remember. Tadeva bhashikara akhide panchayiti. So, pradiprasava heyaga sukshmaha, prasava viruddha pradiprasavaha, pralayaha. So that's why pradiprasava is called pralaya. Pralaya means dissolution. So it called pralaya means dissolution, means the effect going back to the source, the cause. Tathacha pradiprasavena chittasya pralayena sukshma digdhabija bhava klesha heya ityarthaka. That's why it is said, through this pradiprasava, what is happening is these kleshas become almost like burnt seeds which cannot sprout again. So, those who practice this eventually will get out of all negative tendencies, which express so many different ways in our life. There's an idea behind. Of course, this process of counter evolution can be found surprisingly in many of the lives of many of the great spiritual seekers. So, look at Buddha himself. He was not necessarily a practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga, but who must have practiced, because Buddhism produced many great yogis. One of the systems of Mahayana Buddhism is called Yogacara system. That's because they were all great practitioners of yoga. Patanjali yoga system. So Buddha sat under the tree, under the Bodhi tree. So you find in the Buddha Charita, Ashugosha's biography of Buddha, you find Ihasane Sushudu Me Shariram Tugasti Mamsam Che Vilayam Chiyatuhu Aprapi Siddhim Bhu Janma Durlabham Naivasana Kayamatas Chalishyati. So he took this strong vow, Naivasanat Kayamatas Chalishyati. I won't get up from this seat. And he sat under the tree and meditated for long years. And during this process, all his previous life cycles emerged in his mental system. They emerged and he detached himself from them, and they disappeared. So this is what is happening. 544th, according to many others, the Buddha was born as the 544th incarnation. So he had to relive and re-experience all his 543 previous life cycles. He was born in so many different forms, as human being, sometimes an animal kingdom. But each and every birth he manifested, he expressed some unique divine quality. That's how Buddha, Jataka tales you find, Buddha's previous life cycles. So each of these samskaras emerged in his mental world, and he did not identify with them. So all these tendencies completely disappeared. And finally, he became the real Buddha. He emerged as the enlightened one. That's how he became Buddha. So like that, Swami Vivekananda, in one of his lectures, makes a statement, maybe referring, I don't know whether we have no proof that Swamiji was referring to Buddha's life. But anyway, he says that every spiritual seeker who has started his journey in search of his highest spiritual goal will have to relive and re-experience all his previous life cycles. Not physically. Tendencies, impressions, vrittis, vasanas, samskaras, all will emerge in the mental system. And by the practice of meditation, by not meditation as mentioned in the Kriya Yoga, but the higher type of meditation, at the seventh discipline, Ashtanga Yoga, just before Samadhi. That meditation will help you, that is the process of Pratiprasava, will help you to merge all these previous samskaras to dissolve all these previous samskaras in their causes, in the causal forms. And that's how Viveka Khyadi, supreme enlightenment, is created. Now 11th sutra comes, Dhyana heyaha tadvrittayaha. This sutra says these vrittis of the kleshas can be eradicated. Of course, here vritti is not the gross form of klesha, but these are cognitive vrittis which already become weakened. They get completely eradicated by this higher meditation. That's the idea behind it. Tesham kleshanam arabdha karyanam yaha sukha dukkha mohatmika vritteha ta dhyanena eva chitta ega gritale lakshanena heya hatavya ityartha. So, this is Bhoja's view. Bhoja writes in his Rajyamartanda. All these vrittis of kleshas, which are begun as experiences, sorrow, happiness, and so on, they can be completely destroyed by this higher dhyana. And that's how a person completely eradicates all the previous samskaras. The next sutra is Klesha Mulaha Karmasia Drishta Adrishta Janma Vedaniyaha. This is an important sutra which introduces the concept of Karmasia here. This is 12th sutra, 12th one. Klesha Mulaha, that is the Karmasya Drishta Adrishta Janma Vedaniyaha. This residue of previous karma, mean the latent residue of the previous karma, which have got kleshas as the root cause, is to be experienced either in this life or next life, unless they are eradicated. That is the implication here. Now we will discuss this important subject, Karmasya. That is an important subject to remember, because that should be clearly understood before we proceed further. What is Karmasya? As I explained in my previous classes, our mental world can be divided into two categories. One is our experiences. The second one is our reaction to those experiences. These reactions can be in the form of raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, etc. Now what is this karmasya? Or what is klesha? Kleshas, as you mentioned, is that particular phenomenon that activates karma and karma phala. So, what is klesha? Remember, karmasya is the repository of kleshas. So, klesha we already discussed. But remember again, kleshas are nothing but that which activates our karma and karma phala. And as a result of this connecting bridge between karma and karma phala, karma and its result, we experience good and bad, pain and pleasure, anxiety and so on. Now, karmasya is nothing but the repository of all the deep-rooted samskaras which are not necessarily experienced in this life, which are kept in the deeper, lower layers of the mental world, so and thereby becoming the cause of punarjanma or continuing life cycles. So, in other words, when we analyze our own life, and if we can divide our samskaras into two categories. Certain samskaras that we remember to have originated in this life itself. We may have memories of early childhood, early days, and we may perhaps connect our present experiences to what we did or what we experienced in the early years of our life. These are examples of samskaras which more or less are related to this life. But then the tendency to get attracted or to be, let us say, to be detached in whatever way, the tendency, the fundamental cause of extreme liking and extreme dislike. These fundamental causes are coming from previous life cycles. And the samskaras which are responsible for the fundamental attitudes and tendencies that actually divide human beings into so many different categories, make them individual beings. The individuality comes from the individuality of samskaras which are deposited in the system, and that system or the repository of those samskaras is called karmasya. So that's the idea behind here. It means these karmas are remaining there. Of course, impulsive actions coming, which may be the result of our experiences in this life, may not have anything to do with the previous samskaras. But our attitude that caused these impulsive actions may have something to do with that. That's the idea behind. So that is about karmasya. Now, the next sutra is this klesha mula karmasyo drishta adrishta janma vedaniyaha. So these experiences have got two dimensions, and that's why Vajaspati, he says klesha mula karmasya means klesha mulam yasya utpadya chak karyakartane, that for whose production and casual activity the klesha is the root. Any samskaras, any tendencies, any impressions or any attitude for which we cannot find an explanation in this life, but which is strongly established in our mental world, that is coming from a previous experience. And these samskaras become strong and get deposited in the karmasya depending upon the power, the intensity with which that particular action takes place. So if we go through an experience which is very intense, then its effect can last longer. If it is something that is superficial, the effect may not last longer. So, whether a samskara becomes strong enough to be deposited in the karmasya, or whether it will be worked out in this life itself, depends upon the intensity with which that particular action which causes the samskara takes place. And accordingly our attitudes are formed. And yoga psychology eventually takes you to a state where we can ourselves bring out these samskaras and analyze and detach and transcend them, get away from them. That's why I give the example of Buddha's Jataka tales. Of course, Buddha had to confront this problem. Of course, it's not analyzed in this manner in the Buddha Charita Ashwagosha, but then in the light of yoga it becomes very clear, and also Buddha's discussions, his conversations with Ananda and many other disciples often brings out this idea. He also agrees with the idea that no action gets lost, no experience gets completely lost. That experience or action will manifest somehow or other, either in this life or next life. Experiences which are strong, which are intense, which are powerful, will create an impact which may deposit a klesha samskara in the lower layers of the mental world, and that repository of tendency is called karmasya. And these samskaras, which are klesha samskaras, which are very powerful samskaras, can be got rid of, can be eradicated only through intense spiritual practice. But the point is, anyone can start his or her spiritual journey at any point in his or her life. That's why Tapa, Swadhyaya, Ishvara Pranidhananani Kriya Yoga, of which the Kriya Yoga, the simplest discipline mentioned, the Kriya Yoga, is Karma Yoga, because anyone can, without giving up what he is doing, can start doing his day-to-day activities from a different perspective. The change of perspective is possible for everyone. And that is the beginning of spiritual evolution. In other words, that is the beginning of what we now call counter evolution. We called Pratiprasava, means our going back to our original source. Now, these subjects are a bit subtle by nature. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
The recording has